my name is Amy, and I'm going to be talking about Medusa, who is a resilience monster. You guys might know Medusa from Clash of Titans or Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, which is my favorite book. So I'm going to show you a short clip of one of my favorite scenes where Percy enters Medusa's.
Well, this is a fabulous surprise. You have such beautiful hair. I once had hair like that. I was courted, desired by many suitors. But that all changed because of your mother, the woman who cursed me. Who turned me?
And then she ends up chasing Percy Jackson, and I just want to show like one little scene from it.
Don't locate it.
Son of Poseidon. I used to date your daddy.
I think those two short clips show like the relationship between Athena, Poseidon, and Percy Jackson, who is representative of Perseus in Greek and Roman mythology, and their relationship to Medusa. So a lot of people know Medusa as a snake-haired evil monster that turns people into stone, but a lot do not know that she's a sexual assault victim. Her story is an ode to how women have been mistreated from time immemorial. This presentation will argue how gender thinking in patriarchal societies can negatively impact a woman's sexual freedom and how people treat sexually active women. I'll be mentioning the juxtaposition between Medusa and Athena to talk about the definition of femininity, Perseus's encounter with Medusa to compare masculine and feminine gaze, and how people weaponize and demonize her body. Then I will talk about a real-life example through the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal to prove how purity culture, the male gaze, and victim blaming contribute to the oppression of women and how women are treated in society. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, he talks about how Medusa is a beautiful woman that was admired by a lot of men, a human woman. One of those men was Poseidon, a god, who eventually raped her in Athena's temple. And Athena is the goddess of wisdom, who a lot of women looked up to and prayed to for protection. Medusa was actually a priestess under Athena's temple, and that meant that she had to swear an oath of chastity to her. When Poseidon sexually violated Medusa, it automatically broke that promise, and instead of punishing Poseidon, Athena punished Medusa by giving her the snake hair and the stone turning abilities so that no men can look at her again. In Silverman's article called Medusa, Sexuality, Power, Mastery, and Stone Psychoanalytic Observation, she mentions how Athena is an androgynous character that has male and female qualities. Her male qualities has to do with her power, strength, wisdom, and all that stuff related to battles and wars. But then her female qualities have to do with how virginal she is or how chaste she is. Having Athena punish Medusa shows how virginity determines a woman's value. Athena was seen as the model woman to a man because she was sexually abstinent and represented female modesty. Medusa, on the other hand, was cursed and devalued as a human because people considered her to be sexually active. And again, she's not a virgin anymore. The difference between the two characters and their interactions represent the problems with purity culture and how misogynistic views can impact and contribute to that idea. And then moving on to Ovid's Metamorphoses scene where Perseus arrives at Medusa's lair. He sees, quote, sad forms of men and beasts no more themselves, but now change into stone, end quote. And in Keith's article called Medusa's Gaze in Imperial Latin epic In Memoriam R. Elaine Phantom 1933 to 2016, he says something really interesting. On page 153, he says, quote, Perseus sees statue-like results of Medusa's gaze, while Medusa herself is the object of his gaze, end quote. And I think that it highlights the difference between the male and female gaze. The male gaze is just a way of looking at women, either as sexual objects for male desire, or as they're demonized and labeled with derogatory terms such as sluts or whores and stuff like that. Either way, that way of looking empowers men, but it degrades women. And Perseus's gaze is described to be so powerful that it can conquer Medusa just by looking at her as a weapon, something to be collected, something to obtain. But Medusa's gaze is different. She uses her abilities, her stone-turning abilities, against power-hungry men who are seeking her body. So I think it shows the difference between the feminine way and the masculine way of looking at the world. The masculine gaze has to do with power, domination, and objectification, whereas the female gaze calls to reject those ideas and ask for protection from the male gaze. I also want to highlight how she's weaponized. Basically, Medusa is killed by Perseus, and he keeps her as a weapon. He eventually gives it to Athena, and Athena puts it on her aegis, or her battle shield, and it's used to scare away her enemies. And in Silverman's article, again, Medusa, sexuality, power, mastery, and stone psychoanalytic observation, Medusa was known as, quote, an apotrophic weapon, end quote, that warded off evil and is the reason for Athena's strength in battle strategies, good battle strategies. So Medusa was demonized as an evil monster who scared people away, and she's decorated as a piece of flesh that is only beneficial for protection. She's disregarded as a human. Warriors, gods, and men viewed her as something to fear and at the same time something they desired. It proves how devalued she was as a human and as a woman, and it just shows that people of her time demonized and objectified her. I just want to show you a picture of Athena's aegis, and as you can see, there's multiple statues, and you can always see her holding the shield with Medusa's face on it. Medusa was also called a Gorgon multiple times, and Gorgon literally translates to ugly, terrifying, or appalling, and from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. The use of snakes should also be mentioned. In Rodriguez Perez's paper, The Meaning of Snakes in the Ancient Greek World, she mentions how snakes are viewed as animals that need to be tamed. By cursing Medusa with that snake hair, the world is calling her untamable, undomesticated, and unwomanly. In the modern world, this would be equivalent to slut shaming, and her value as a woman is plummeted in their eyes. But yeah, she was raped by Poseidon. She was defenseless as a human compared to a god, and that snake-haired curse represents how society view women as savages or uncontrollable when they defy patriarchal expectations, such as losing their virginity. So Medusa's story is similar to many women in today's society, where they're expected to be sexually abstinent, they're sexualized by men and demonized when they defy or don't live up to misogynistic expectations. So one example is Monica Lewinsky, who is infamous for her sexual scandal with Bill Clinton, our former president. After their affair was revealed, Bill Clinton publicly denied it by saying that he didn't have a sexual relationship with her, and he called her that woman. And that term, that woman, was something that followed her for the rest of her life, because she was known as a seductress, sexual predator, and sadly, she was known as a slut to many Americans today. Monica Lewinsky is our modern day Medusa. When the world learned about both of their sexual affairs, Medusa and Lewinsky were criticized as frivolous and unwomanly, but the men in their time weren't punished. Poseidon wasn't cursed, he wasn't revoked of his god status, and Bill Clinton wasn't punished for it. He was impeached, but that wasn't because of the scandal. Both women had to deal with the consequences that are caused by these men, and they were humiliated and dehumanized, all because the world knew that they were sexually active. So purity culture is something very toxic and detrimental to women because men will use body count to determine how much a woman's worth. According to Blair and Madigan's Dating Attitudes and Expectations Among Young Chinese Adults examination of gender difference, they found that men will, quote, seek females with greater physical attractiveness, youth, and chastity, end quote, and mentions how men will look for sexually abstinent women to marry. Purity culture dictates how women should act, restricts their sexual agency, and promotes sexism. Celibacy and sexual abstinent expectations on women are destructive because they enforce patriarchal notions and dictate what a woman should and shouldn't do with her body. Men are praised when they have multiple sexual partners, but women are demonized when they lose their virginity, even if they were raped or not. This double standard of what is sexually appropriate restricts women from expressing sexual agency and convey the idea that if a woman is not a virgin, she's not valuable. So, for example, Medusa was kicked out of Athena's temple again for being raped by Poseidon. Her losing her virginity was the only thing that Athena saw, and it angered her so much that Medusa was banished, cursed, and humiliated because now she's considered invaluable. Women are viewed as a secondary sex to men because the male gaze devalues them as either sexual objects or demonizes them. And the problem is sexism. Sexism cannot be solved overnight. And though that is true, I do believe that rejecting toxic masculinity and adopting feminism can help us move towards a more inclusive world. Toxic masculinity is societal pressures put on men to be a manly man, which allows them to be a part of the in-group. And that includes acting a certain way, including misogynistic behaviors or speech. Feminism is the complete opposite, where it calls for women to be a part of that in-group and asks that people eradicate sexual prejudices and reject the male gaze. One other thing I think is really important is to communicate. According to Farraco and Laporte's article called National Institute of Justice, Investing in Innovation for Identification, Collection, and Analysis of Sexual Assault Evidence, they mentioned how, quote, 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime, and 77% of those rapes or sexual assault went unreported to law enforcement in 2016, end quote. The Me Too movement is a great example of how communication can cause changes quickly. Women have been posting stories online and sharing their experiences about sexual abuse, and it holds men accountable for their actions, for their wrongdoings. It prevents them from hiding behind the patriarchal mask because they're being punished for what they're doing. Despite what is known, anti-feminists might argue that feminism means oppressing men. Trading one extreme for another does not solve that issue, and not what I am implying. Feminism comes from a place where women were seen as unequal and secondary to men. The point of feminism is to create a power, like a balance of power, and it calls for society to reject the male gaze and not at all overpowering men or taking away men's rights. So continuing with the Percy scene, the Medusa scene ends when Percy eventually slices off her head and kills her. He then collects the head and uses her as a weapon because her eyes work dead or alive. And he uses her on the Hydra, which the three, Annabeth, Grover, and Percy Jackson, encounter later. So Medusa is a monster whose stories is misconstrued by a patriarchal society that she lived in. From the contrast between Athena, Medusa, analysis of Percy's encounter with Medusa, and the weaponization of her body, it's clear that she faces similar problems to women in the modern world, like Monica Lewinsky. Both women were seen as frivolous because purity expectations, and they were victim blamed under the male gaze. Medusa should be viewed as empowering rather than feared. Even after she was humiliated, cursed, and blamed, she built a name for herself as a woman who defeated powerful men and beasts with one look. Her eyes symbolize the retaliation against the male gaze and how potent and strong it can be. The stone-turned men are a representation of the patriarchy turning into stone, which calls women to stand up against it. Through this presentation, I hope I convinced you that Medusa should be told retold as a victim of gender expectations instead of a gruesome snake-haired monster in Greek and Roman mythology. The monster advocates for women's rights and is a representation of the consequences of viewing women as subhuman. The myth of Medusa asks people to gaze through the patriarchal lens and to re-examine how sexually active women are thought of, talked about, and treated in society. It asks women to retaliate against and calcify the patriarchal expectations to create that equality. So, to me, Medusa is a monstrous reflection of the male gaze, and at the same time, she represents the resilience to it. And now that you've learned a little bit about Medusa, I want to mention why she's so important to me. So my older sister is a victim of sexual assault, and growing up in a conservative and misogynistic culture like Vietnamese culture, people blamed my sister for acting the way she did or how she dressed instead of the person that attacked her. And she told me a story of Medusa and eventually got this tattoo of her on her left arm. And as you can see through the tattoo, she added like scars on her eyes and her neck to represent that abuse. That tattoo of Medusa was something I didn't really include in my paper, so I wanted to highlight here. But many sexually assaulted women have been getting Medusa tattoos to, one, represent resilience and taking back the power after those tragedies, and two, to ward off evil because, again, Medusa is an electrified weapon, which means she repels negative energy. And I just think that it's interesting that her story is coming to light now, and people are starting to view her as more than a snake-haired, gruesome monster. So yeah, thank you for listening to my presentation. These are just my citations. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed.